Over the next few weeks, we're going to dive back into the Old Testament. We're going to look at God's deliverance of His people. Now, back from the time of Abraham onward, we see God making preparations to establish the Israelite people for Himself. Now, it comes to a pivotal time with the deliverance of the Hebrew people from the slavery in Egypt. And that is one of the greatest, to me at least, one of the greatest pictures of the sovereignty of God and how His providence is always at work to accomplish His purposes. Now, let me ask you a question. When we think about God's sovereignty, when we think about His absolute power, does that idea bring you comfort? Does it make you a little bit nervous? Does it give you a sense of security? Or does it make you, in some ways, tremble in fear? Or is it something else? You know, when we think about God's sovereignty, when we think about His absolute power, we see that displayed all throughout Scripture. And when it comes down to it, really what it should do is give us a great sense of comfort and a sense of security, knowing that God is in control no matter what. Now, picking back up from our last time in the Old Testament, where we were talking about Joseph and his time with his family and his authority that he gained in Egypt, over 400 years have passed since that account in Genesis. You know, Joseph, remember, was reunited with his family. He brought them to Egypt, and they were there. There it was where they were going to survive the famine. Now, new Egyptian rulers had come into place, of course, over those span of hundreds of years, and they were no longer connected to Joseph's legacy. They didn't know really probably who Joseph was. And the Egyptians became concerned with the growing number of Israelites. Their population had grown. And as a result of that, the Jews became an enslaved people. That was one way, I suppose, the Egyptians thought they could deal with the Jewish problem, is we'll just make them into forced laborers. Now, in two episodes, in two series of events, newborn Hebrew boys were ordered by the Egyptians to be killed. But here's the great thing. God was at work in a way only possible for Him, even through those tragic deaths. We often look at the beginning of the book of Exodus, which is where we're going to be at today. A lot of times we look at Exodus, we begin reading that, and we think, well, this is a story about Moses. But here's the reality. It's really, just like the rest of the Bible, it's a story about God, about how God, in this case, was raising up a deliverer for His people. Now, that deliverer in Exodus just happened to be a man named Moses. It's God's story, though, like the rest of the Bible. And now, through this first part of Moses' life here in the beginning of Exodus, we see God's sovereignty. We see His power. We see His providence at work. If you want to get your Bible out or open up your Bible app, you can follow along in Exodus beginning in chapter 2, verse 1. And what we learn here is that Moses' parents were from the tribe of Levi. Now, that may not seem an important fact at the moment, but one day, if you know the rest of your Old Testament, one day the Levites are going to become the priestly tribe. So isn't it interesting here how already that Moses, who was going to be the deliverer of his people, who God was going to use for that purpose, comes from that tribe of Levi. Now, as a babe, and I think most of us are familiar with this story, as a baby, Moses is placed in that mini ark, in that basket, because his family, his parents are trying to save him from the Egyptians who are trying to, put to death all these newborn male children. He's put in that little mini ark, that little basket, and he's hidden by the reeds of the river Nile. But it's there he's found, and he's adopted by, guess who? None other than Pharaoh's daughter. And she unknowingly asks Moses, his own mother, to care for him through his whole babyhood, I guess we could call it. And then Pharaoh's daughter adopts him. So Moses is brought up in the royal household with the double advantage of having an Egyptian education, an Egyptian upbringing, but at the same time being in his mother's care. Now, who could have worked any of that out except God? Now, as a young man, when he gets older, Moses is moved, and he's moved in his heart by the awful hardship of his people. One day he is out and he loses his temper and he kills an Egyptian who is beating one of his fellow Hebrews. Now, as a result, Moses has to flee the country. He has to run away before something happens to him, and he goes to live in Midian, where he marries a priest's daughter named Zipporah. And there they start a family, and for many years Moses works as a shepherd for his father-in-law. Now, Moses may have thought at this point in his life that he'd spend the rest of his days as a shepherd there in Midian. But God had other plans. The people had been crying out to God because of their oppression, because of that enslavement in Egypt and their treatment. And God, of course, had heard their pleas. In Exodus chapter 2, verse 24, it says that God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and had compassion on their descendants. As we walk through this account today, I want you to hear and listen to how God planned to rescue his people from slavery. And I want you to think, how much faith would you have had about his plan if you had been Moses? So here's the way this account goes. One day, Moses was tending his father-in-law's flocks on a mountainside, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a burning bush. Now, this bush was on fire, but it was not burning up. So obviously that attracted Moses' attention. He was curious. So he went closer to see this bush. And when he got near to it, God spoke to him. He told Moses to take off his sandals because he was standing on holy ground. Then God identified himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Now, God said he had seen his people's misery in Egypt, and he was going to bring them to the promised land. And he was going to send Moses to Pharaoh to bring the people out of Egypt. Now, Moses didn't understand how in the world this was going to happen, and he tells God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" But God assured Moses that he would be with him and that Israel would worship at that very spot, at that very mountain one day. Now, Moses asked, what should I tell the Israelites when they ask, "Who sent you?" And God said, "I am who I am." This is what you're to say to the Israelites. "I am has sent me to you." And this is what God commanded Moses to do. First, Moses was to meet with the other Israelite elders and to let them know God had seen what was done to his people in Egypt and that he promised to bring them out of Egypt to deliver them to the land that he had promised their ancestors. Secondly, Moses was to go with the elders to Pharaoh and tell the Pharaoh that God commands them to go on a 3-day journey to offer sacrifices to him. Now, God informed Moses, however, that the Pharaoh would not listen. And this was going to be this way, so God could demonstrate his great power, his sovereignty, and his wonders. After that, the Pharaoh would let the people go. Now, these wonders that God told Moses about, these spoken of in verse 20, were these plagues that he was going to send to convince Pharaoh to let his people go. And then finally, what did the Lord want Moses to do? He wanted Moses to assure the Israelites that once God had finished demonstrating his might, that the Egyptians would let the Hebrews go. And get this, even give them gold, silver, and clothing for their journey. Now, this would encourage the Israelites for sure, but it would also fulfill a promise that was given to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 15, verse 14. So not only are they going to receive the promised land, but at the same time, the Israelites are also going to be leaving with some plunder. So I want us to think back through this account that we talked about. What are some of the signs of God's sovereignty? What are some of the signs of his power? What are some of the signs of his authority that really stood out to you in what happened here in this part of Moses' life? Is it the fact that that this deliverer would come from the tribe of Levi, and knowing that in the future that the Levites would be set aside as the priests? Maybe it was the ability to hide baby Moses, that his parents were able to protect him for all those 3 months, and he was never captured as a baby, and they were able to hide him in that basket, in that little mini ark there in the River Nile. And maybe it's just from that point, it's that whole Nile incident that really strikes you at God's providence and God's hand being involved in that, his sovereignty, in that Moses was discovered by none other than Pharaoh's own daughter, and that of all people to be chosen as Moses' nursemaid, who was it? It was Moses' mother. Who else could have orchestrated that? Maybe it was that God chose Moses at all. Maybe it was even the fact that Moses was one that God chose to use in the first place. Maybe, of course, like a lot of people, the most striking thing to you in this account is the bush, right? It's that burning bush that was on fire. It had flames on it, but it was not consumed. Perhaps it was God's promise to be with Moses and the signs that he would show Pharaoh that God already knew the outcome of everything that was going to happen. There's any number of things. Really, that whole account, we see God's sovereignty on display. We see His absolute power on display. We see His providence, that even these things that we would look at and call luck, or we would call happenstance or coincidence, we see even in those kind of situations how God uses all of that to accomplish His purposes. Now, if we think about Moses, from the time when he fled Egypt and he went to live and was a shepherd in Midian, the some odd 40 years that he spent there, do you think Moses had changed over those 4 decades since that time of fleeing Egypt to the time of the burning bush? You know, before we get this idea that Moses was somewhat brash. He was a little impulsive how he went there, you know, and killed that Egyptian and then had to run away. How even when he went to Midian and he protected his future wife and those around there from the others who were coming to that well. You can read that in the account there. But Moses was rather brash and he was somewhat impulsive. Perhaps feeling like he could change things in his own power and in his own strength, that he could help his own people. But after 40 years as a shepherd, you know, I think till that burning bush experience, I think Moses' attitude had really changed, because when God spoke to him through that bush, what did Moses say? He said, "Who am I to do this thing?" You know, I think those years in Midian, Moses learned some humility. Now, if we think about Moses in general, you know, and again, remember, this story is God's story. It's not really Moses' story. It's a story about Moses, but Moses is not the focus and not really the hero in this. And if we really think about it, was Moses anything special? Do you think he was? If you think Moses was special, why was it? If you think Moses wasn't special, why do you think that? The reason I think that's a good question is because, remember, this account has more to do with what God would do through Moses than really what Moses possessed himself. Really, we already talked about Moses was kind of impetuous. His personality, he was trying to intervene in things with his own strength and his own wisdom. But I think God did see in Moses was Moses had a very strong sense of justice, right? He wanted justice for his people. And God chose Moses. Do you want to know why? Because God is God. Just as He chose the Israelite people in the first place, it wasn't because of them. It was because it was God's sovereign choice. God calling Moses, or for that matter, God calling any of us, was to grant him, and it's to grant us, authority for His purposes. God used for His purposes the natural bents of Moses, and sometimes even in spite of his natural bent. I'm sure God took advantage of Moses' daring and his courage and his sense of justice. And later on, after spending those decades in Midian, he used and utilized Moses' humility. And here's the thing, God can do the same thing with us. Now, I think there's something important for us to consider right now where we are when we think about this account that we read in Exodus chapter 2 and 3. God does not have to call us in some special way like He did Moses. Now, He might do that, and He can do that. After all, He is God. And God still calls people every day to very specific purposes. A call to ministry, a call to a certain type of service, any number of ways. God can still call people for specific purposes. But here's the thing, we're not to just sit around as a Christian and wait for some burning bush experience. That was an experience that was unique to Moses. Nowhere else in the Bible do we see another burning bush experience. We can know God's will for us. It's in His Word. And at that very basic level, and I've heard many people say this because I've asked it myself, if we ever say, well, I'm just waiting here until God reveals His will to me. Maybe in your mind you're thinking, I'm just waiting for my own burning bush experience. Well, here's the thing. The Bible tells us God's will for us. In the most basic way, listen to these 2 things that we know is God's will for every believer. Number 1 is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. It's from Matthew chapter 22. The greatest commandment, right? And number 2, in the Great Commission, to make disciples, teaching them to observe all that Jesus has commanded. You see right there, those are two very specific things that we know are the will of God for His people, for Christians today. So if you ever find yourself saying, I don't know what God's will is for my life, remember those two things. Now, unless you know God is calling you to stop, to wait for Him, then we're to do those two things. And if we're ever struggling with God's already revealed will to us, how do we think, if we're struggling with loving the Lord our God and loving our neighbor and having a desire to make disciples, if we're struggling with that, how do you think we would ever react if we did have a true burning bush experience? I think it's very important when we read a story like that from the Old Testament that we remember that the underlying emphasis there is on God. It's on His story, and it's on His. It's a display of His power and His authority. And above all else, all those events and all those things that happen are done so that God can be glorified above everything else. You guys have an awesome day, and God bless. Bye.